economic recovery, structural reforms, as well as fighting corruption and strengthening the state capacity to carry out the constitutional obligations that we have in the program of action that government has adopted for the next few years towards the end of this sixth administration. So I think the minister has laid out the context where our economy is and the fact that the economy will be growing by 3.3% and where the global economy is and how we intend to contribute towards economic growth by doing exactly the things that are well articulated in the State of the Nation address, supporting the vaccine rollout, economic recovery, structural reforms, but also there are certain tax issues that were well articulated. And I think the team here, led by the DG, will be in a position to take us through. So let me hand over to the DG to take us from here, including guiding us on how we should move forward. But I'll also check where the minister is, if he has not joined already. Thank you so much, Chair.
The
Minister has joined.
Am I in the correct meeting?
Yes, I already apologize for you that you are here. We were here earlier at 12, and that you'll definitely join. But we felt that we should just start. But we had not, if you like, started with our presentation as a Department of Finance. Over to you, Minister.
No, go ahead, because you've already introduced the team, so the choreography is the same. So let's go ahead to save on time. Thank you, and greetings to the members.
You're welcome, Minister. DG, over to you. Can you please gallop and talk to the slides? Don't read every point which is there on the slides, as we have got a long presentation and a very tight day today. Over to you, DG.
Thank you very much. If you go to the next slide, honorable members, good afternoon. We, as the Deputy Minister says, I think when we presented this budget, we had to make sure that we balance a whole lot of things. And we, on one hand, it's important that we promote economic activity, and on the second hand, we have to ensure that we retain public finances to a sustainable path. And that's the main, important issue here that this budget is all about. The other immediate priority on our members is to return the economic growth, to return to rapid economic growth, especially having locked down the economy before. And we think this mass vaccination program will give us that opportunity to support reopening of the economy and for economic activity to start. And we think, based on that and many other factors, growth will, will reach 3.3% in 2021-22. And in terms of the fiscal policy, there is short-term support of things that we need to do, including fiscal consolidation that's critical, and stabilize debt. You'll remember, honorable members, that previously our debt was stabilizing much higher than where it is now. So with the performance on the revenue side, and including some good green shoots that we saw started coming through, resources were obviously available, and we can see that they're stabilizing to 88% of GDP. The other important thing that Deputy Minister mentioned is that around tax measures, we are withdrawing the 40 billion rand that we had indicated this time around last year, so that we give relief, including the 2.2 billion relief to mainly in low-income households and middle-income households. So this budget also focused on that, whilst it's doing many other things. And we have signaled, as you heard in the ministers, that we want to look at the CIT in 2022 and have a process between now and then to see options and possibilities that can emerge. So given that signaling was quite important for us. The other fine thing that we want to raise in this budget, and that we raised was that debt service costs continue to really be a burden for us. We've increased the contingency reserve to about 12 billion to take care of the vaccination and other priority programs and other emergencies that may emerge during the course of the year. And that's something that is important. But at the end, Deputy Minister, I don't know what happened. Is to ensure that we support Vlindler and come up with operational issues that are critical to actually bring the economy back to firing at all cylinders. So I will stop here just in terms of the overview, Chair, and give over to Duncan, who will take us through some of the slides. Also, quickly, just tell us where exactly the premise is of some of the things that got us to do things that you are presenting. And thereafter, Edgar Sishi and other colleagues will come through as we present. Thank you very much, Chair. Duncan?
Thanks, DG. Good afternoon, honorable members. I just will be giving you a brief overview of the global and domestic economic outlook. The first table there just talks to our global growth prospects, which of course, as we know, has been boosted by the vaccine rollout globally, as well as stimulus both on the fiscal side and the monetary side, particularly in the developed countries. We therefore expect a global growth recovery that will be supportive for South Africa. In particular, the recovery that we're seeing in China, which is towards the middle of the table there, which is quite robust, and which, as our largest trading partner, will be giving support to the South African economy. China's forecast to grow in 2021 at 8.1%, and India, another large trading partner of South Africa, is forecast to grow at 11.5%. And that, of course, bodes quite well for what we are expecting in South Africa. Our growth rates, which are also in that table, have been revised down slightly better, in fact, in 2020, from -7.8 to -7.2. In 2021, our growth rate remains the same at 3.3 in real terms, and then in 2022, it goes to 2.2%. Next slide, please. The next slide gives us the components of growth from the expenditure side, which is how we look at it. So I've already gone through, honorable members, the middle section of that table, which tells you our new anticipation of real GDP growth in 2020, as well as the outlook over the medium term. What this table now does is goes into some of those details, and I'd like to bring your attention to the 2021 column. That first item there is household consumption, which has been revised down to 2.9% in 2021. And that is mainly due to the pressure we are seeing on households, both from the second wave that we saw into the beginning of 2021 and what that does to economic activity, as well as the impact of the changes in unemployment and what that means for household incomes and the joblessness that has an impact on the ability of households to consume. The second line there in the 2021 column is the final government consumption line, which is actually, although it is a negative 0.1, it has actually been revised much stronger. It was around -2% at the time of the MTBPS. And the reason that number's been revised stronger, Edgar will talk to that later, but that really is about some of the expenditure that government has prioritized this year, including the vaccine rollout, the additional social relief of distress grant funding that's been made available, as well as the presidential employment program or initiative. And those additional government consumption spending shows up in a stronger government consumption number in 2021. And finally, I'd just like to bring members' attention to the gross fixed capital formation, which is a number of -2.4, which has also been brought a little bit lower. due to the uncertainty of the pandemic and what that means for companies and their investment, as well as the ongoing electricity constraint and the reliability of the electricity system that is quite weak, and therefore affecting the investment choices made by companies. A successful vaccine rollout is likely to boost growth. And of course, there's a big uncertainty around COVID-19. Next slide. There has been some progress on the economic recovery plan. Honorable members, I won't be going through all of these details. I just wanted to make the broad point that it is very important for us to work on making sure that we get these structural reforms through so that they can in fact boost our potential growth and raise the ability of the economy to create jobs, which, as we saw with the latest jobs numbers, is a key priority of the government. And this slide just talks to some of the progress that has been made. Next slide. And then finally, on our side, a big part of the progress that we are making is due to Operation Vlindler, which is a joint initiative between the Presidency and the National Treasury, and it focuses on a particular subset of reforms, particularly in the network industry space, transport, water, electricity, and telecommunications. Deputy Minister Masondu is leading us there, and we are working closely as the Treasury with a team under the leadership of Dr. Sean Phillips, as well as with the team at the Presidency with Mr. Rudy Dix. And these are the reforms that we are focusing on. And in previous budgets, we have spoken about what the impact on growth these reforms could have, and we've done that technical work, and it shows us that if we do get these reforms through, it can have an impact on growth, and it can raise our economic growth rates or potential growth higher than 3%. And that's why Operation Vlindler is such a big focus of us at the moment. Thank you, honorable members. At this point, I'll hand over to Edgar to talk to the fiscal strategy.
Thank you. Our strategy is predicated on 3 objectives. The first is to narrow the deficit and stabilize debt. The second is to provide continued short-term support to the economy. And the third is to improve the composition of spending, therefore promoting growth by shifting from consumption to investment. And that obviously implies reducing the growth in the compensation budgets. This is the balancing act that we are engaging in over the medium term in this budget. We consider that our efforts to reduce the growth in compensation remain on track. The National Treasury's role in ensuring that settlements in wages are affordable has been affirmed. We do, however, consider that significant risks remain, including as it relates to the public sector wage bill, but also as it relates to the state of state-owned companies. However, the biggest risk is the macroeconomic outlook, as Duncan, as it relates to the uncertainty on the recovery due to its dependence on the vaccine. Just as a reflection, it's important to be reminded of South Africa's fiscal position in the global context. We, as indicated in the past, have noted that South Africa's debt situation and other fiscal policies are not like other emerging market countries around the world. Indeed, South Africa's debt overhangs are more severe. Some of you will know the average emerging market debt situation at the moment is around 60% of GDP. South Africa's debt levels are 20% higher than that, closer to advanced economy territory. As a result, the service costs on that debt, the debt service costs, are expected to average over 20% of tax revenues, which means that out of every 5 Rand in taxes that we collect, 1 Rand goes towards servicing debt. This is twice as large as the median for South Africa's peer countries, as indicated in the slide. South Africa's borrowing similarly remains large standards, as I indicated, and this is indicated in part by the budget deficit. Previously, we indicated that South Africa's deficit has been in negative territory for over a decade, including the primary deficit, and this is expected to be the case, but be more reduced over the medium term. And this is an important foundation for how we think about our fiscal policy approach going forward, because the stance has been expansionary for a very long time when looking at the primary deficit. Let me begin by indicating where we are compared to the 2020 budget. Since the 2020 budget, the deficit has doubled, and the in-year shortfall on revenue is estimated at 213.2 billion rand. These changes reflect the impact of the pandemic, as well as government's response to the pandemic, which prioritizes relief for households and businesses alongside a major effort to fund public health. This revenue shortfall remains significant both this year and over the MTF, however, is somewhat improved compared to the estimates from the MTBPS. As the DG indicated earlier, for the purposes of achieving fiscal consolidation, we had penciled in some tax increases. We are now announcing that these tax measures will not be implemented as part of this budget. The tax proposals in the current budget for the purposes of 2021-22 includes higher than inflation adjustments to the personal income tax bracket. So there's direct tax relief of about 2.2 billion rands. And this is offset by an increase in excise duties, as the minister announced during yesterday's speech and as reflected here. Compared to the 2020 budget, main budget non-interest expenditure decreases by 265 billion rands over the medium term. This is somewhat less than what we anticipated both in the June special adjustments budget, but also during the MTBPS, where we're anticipating higher non-interest expenditure reductions. So the non-interest expenditure reductions are somewhat lower than were projected at the time of the MTBPS, as indicated here. In 2021-22 in particular, there are significant increases, particularly for the vaccine and other health pressures related to COVID-19, including an increase in the contingency reserve, as reflected here towards the latter part of this table, to 12 billion rands in 2021. There are other additions that are made and other amounts that are made available through reprioritization, additions for the Public Employment Initiative of 11 billion and recapitalization of land for the South African Revenue Services over the MDF. The fiscal framework provides short-term support, as I indicated, to low-income households. There's a 3-month extension of the special COVID-19 relief, social relief of distress grant, as well as an extension of the unemployment insurance funds TERS scheme, as announced by the president. Additional funds, 10.3 billion for the vaccine, but in addition to that 10.3 billion, as I indicated, the contingency reserve is increased in order to make provision for any unforeseen spending pressures arising from both the vaccine or any other emergencies. The plan that we have presented as part of this fiscal strategy is designed to narrow the deficit over time and stabilize public debt. As you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, and as we have indicated on numerous occasions in the past, the fiscal deficit has been in negative territory for more than a decade. red line that you see in the graph on the left-hand side, while the light gray line is the tax revenues of government, or mostly the tax revenues of government. And as you can see, government has been spending quite a bit higher than its revenue for a very long time. And this is why the debt has accumulated to the projected 3.9 trillion rands that it will be at the end of next month. The deficit expanded quite dramatically during the current year, as I indicated. At a consolidated level, it more than doubled to 14%. But this fiscal strategy that we tabled yesterday is designed to close that fiscal gap, as you can see, over the medium term, and as a consequence of that, begin to stabilize the gross debt to GDP outlook for government. In the graph on the right-hand side, you can see the debt levels, which are anticipated to reach just over 80% of GDP in the current financial year. This will rise, but not by as much as was anticipated at the time of the NTBPS, due to the reasons which I've outlined earlier, mostly on the revenue side. And so we anticipate to stabilize the debt to GDP at 88.9% of GDP in 88.9% in 2025-26. I've already indicated the narrowing of the consolidated deficit, so I'm not going to go through this, but it is important to indicate how we do this. We do it by mostly reducing growth in the wage bill, but at the same time, we consider that the consolidation effort is growth friendly because it provides support to economic development efforts, in particular by raising the level of capital spending in the budget. The infrastructure fund, for example, continues to receive support in this budget. This slide shows the makeup of the different economic classifications of the budget and how they grow over the medium term. As you can see, putting aside interest payments, capital transfers and capital payments have the fastest growth in this budget. And that is, as I indicated, part of our strategy towards a pro-growth consolidation that focuses on the infrastructure program of government in line with the economic recovery and reconstruction plan. Compensation of employees, which is by far the largest consumption item in the budget, grows minimally. Indeed, the growth rate in compensation is essentially, for all intents and purposes, frozen over the MTF. Notwithstanding the reductions which I referred to earlier, the budget is still very much focused on the social wage. Huge portions of this budget are funding pro-poor programs. And if you look at the makeup of this budget, as reflected here, over half of the allocations go towards learning and culture, which is dominated by education, and then health and social development. Indeed, education and social development are by far the largest parts of this budget, far bigger than any other items. 1.2 trillion rands will be spent mostly on education in this budget, followed by social development, which of course is dominated by the social grants. A big challenge remains the debt service costs, as I indicated. A key part of our strategy is focused on reducing the interest burden emanating from the debt that we have accumulated over a number of years. This interest burden is now expected to reach over 900 billion rands over the MTEF. And our strategy is to prevent that from growing any further. The division of revenue remains redistributive. Indeed, the allocations through the intergovernmental fiscal system provide higher per capita allocations to rural provinces and municipalities. If you look at the shares in this table, at the bottom part of the table, you can see that the shares, including for provinces and local government, will be marginally higher over the MTF than they were before. As I head towards a close, this is the last two slides, want to reflect on the financial position of state-owned companies, which remain in many of them in distress and at a risk of default on their debt. The net asset value of DFIs in particular has fallen considerably in the last financial year. Quite a lot of this is due to the losses at the Land Bank, which I've touched on earlier, as well as the Industrial Development Corporation. The Land Bank is proposed to receive money for recapitalization, which will come through reprioritizing within the existing spending envelope of government. In closing then, let me reflect on the risks to the framework. We understand and we publish risks in the Fiscal Risk Monitor, or Fiscal Risk Statement rather, every year in the MTBPS, and we did the same in the 2020 MTBPS. But this is a summary of the risks that we see to the framework. The first, as I indicated, is in respect of the pandemic itself and what that might do to economic activity and therefore the disruptions in that regard. The second is, of course, on the compensation side, the wage bill does remain a key fiscal risk, given size overall in the envelope, as well as its role in the consolidation effort. The third risk is in respect of the financial position of public entities, state-owned companies as well, and local government, which remains in many parts in a weak financial position. There is finally a risk emanating from debt redemptions of state-owned companies. And this, of course, underlines the importance of improving the financial management and resolving issues related to state-owned companies. I'll stop there. This slide is a conclusion of what I've already said. So I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
DG, hello, DG, are you done with the presentation with your team?
No, thank you very much. We are done.
Okay. Minister and Deputy Minister, you will come at the end, or when we do you do the responses, or you want to come now before members?
No, Chair, I'm sorry to do this to you. I think all members have got the budget review in front of them. I just want to draw your attention to something that you have already looked at. At the beginning of the budget review, we have put in place budget highlights, which I think members have looked at already, which deals with the economic outlook, which is what Duncan was dealing with. It summarizes the budget framework, which is what Edgar was dealing with. And then he also, ideally, we should be going to details about the spending programs, but Edgar has given us the macro picture. But if Mampo is on the line, maybe she could deal with the spending programs. The text proposals, I think Edgar has dealt with, which is fine. The next page deals with the key budget statistics, which is sort of the budget at a glance, in a sense. And I would like to encourage members to spend a bit of time looking at that. I think you've done so already, but I'm just buttressing the point that in order for us to have a fruitful conversation, it's useful to always keep that summary in mind. And I try and keep it literally in mind, in the mind. The next page which I want to spend 2 seconds on it, which says budget expenditure. I think it's an important page. What's happening? I think it's an important page. On the left column, so to say, is the consolidated government expenditure. It indicates 2.02 trillion, which is a lot of money. And then on the right, it indicates out of that 2.02 trillion, how much is social services, which is 1.21 trillion. And again, I would like to encourage members to go through this and always have it in mind. On the left is economic development, allocations to support economic development. It's important to emphasize the point that economic development is not just going to take place based on a budget like this one. This is meant to support economic activity, to generate economic, the animal spirits of economic agents to get on with the economy and get going. For example, we'll say agriculture and rural development, 27.4 billion. That 27.4 billion cannot carry the whole agriculture. It's just meant to support. Can't carry ZZ2. It's meant to support farmers, economic agents, private enterprise in agriculture, and so on. Peace and security, you'll see it there. General public services, public admin and fiscal affairs, executive and legislation processes, external affairs, and then the debt service costs that Edgar spoke about, which this year will be 269.7 billion rand, something not to be happy about. We shouldn't be very concerned about this. But on the right, on social services, as you can see, learning and culture, as Edgar was pointing, going down. So, and that social services part, I think, accounts for about 36% of the budget. So when people talk austerity, I don't know what they're talking about. If, for example, 56% of your budget is social services. But anyway, it's in the nature of politics. People have to be seen to be saying something smart and clever, I suppose. I was just summarizing and drawing your attention to the importance of this slide that we should take account of. And Mampo, if Mampo is somewhere on the line, I would like her to look at the line that deals with the party political funding, because I think that is going to become an issue of concern to many of the political parties in parliament. So Mampo, if you're on the line, please look out for that page that deals with political party funding so that we can mention it at the end. You can show the slide at the end of the presentation. Honorable Chair,
Enkomo, all of those at the Maliga Republic, Africa Zone. Honorable members, that's the briefing from the minister and the team. Those who like to make comments, ask questions, can do so by raising their hands in the platform. Secretariat will assist me in identifying members who would like to speak. For now, I see Honorable Dipuo Peters, Dr. George, Louis, Dennis Ryder, Honorable Kaiso, Honorable Phoebe, who's, I think is Noxie.
That's me, Chair. That's me. Sorry for that. I'll rename.
I
know. I don't normally use it.
Morolong, Valley Ocamp, Vusmuzi Chawalala. Yeah, I'm sure.
Slalo,
Uthini mshemu?
the right, Chair. I don't know how is yourself.
No. So far, so good. Better than yesterday.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Let's start. Honorable Peters, over to you.
Apologies, sorry, Chair. You've missed Honorable Sarupen.
Honorable Sarupen. Okay. Honorable Asho Sarupen. Okay. Are we done from your side, Secretariat, in regard to members who would like to speak?
Yes, Chair, that's all.
Okay. If others come during the process of discussions and questions, you will assist me. Over to you, Honorable Peters.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. If given an opportunity, I'll come back later, but I've got one or two questions right now. The one, can I switch off my video?
Yes.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you very much, Minister and Deputy Minister and National Treasury team for the presentation. It is really helpful. But my question is with regard to the fact that in the previous years, the growth projections that you provided us as National Treasury have been very optimistic, but had to be revised downward later. The Minister has since announced that the economy is expected to rebound by 3.3% this year from 7.2 contraction in 2020. Clearly, we cannot expect a V-shaped rebound in South Africa, whereas some countries, including our partners in BRICS, China and India, are projecting rebounds higher than the rate of contraction. Why is South African economy not projected to rebound as strongly as these other developing countries? Can we trust that the National Treasury growth models that they will be, the models that you have presented to us will be more accurate in this particular period? Another question, Chairperson, is that in the past few years, we have been celebrating GDP growth below 2%, and the economy is not creating enough jobs. At this rate, the National Development Plan objectives of halving unemployment and poverty by 2030 looks achievable. Comrade Minister, you know we are in 2021, so the NDP targets for 2030 are left with about 8 to 9 years. Why is it that our economy cannot grow beyond 2%? What is it that we still need to do as a country? What is the role of the private sector in working together with government to make it possible that our economy can grow? How will the jobs that are much needed in this country be created? And how will government generate revenues if the economy is not growing fast enough? It is a concern, Chairperson. If you look at the number of queues of people who queue for the social relief of distress, and it tells you that the number of people that are unemployed. And I'll make an example, Chairperson, to the Minister, that usually when political program and the mass work is allowed, not according to COVID, like now we are in level 3, when you convene a meeting of the public at 10 o'clock, Comrade Minister, and the stadium is full, I get worried because that is a clear indication of the number of people that are unemployed. So it tells you that there's a lot that still needs to be done. But what is the partnership that government through National Treasury is having with the private sector to make it possible that we truly can, for once, have a massive battle against this poverty? Thank you, Chairperson. If given another opportunity, I will come back.
Thanks very much, Honorable Peters. Dr. George, over to you.
Thank you, Chairperson. Honorable Peters has touched on the growth issue. The GDP projections do seem unrealistic and therefore significantly distort the budget projections. And I think that's something we need to pay very close attention to. Our economy can't grow if entrepreneurs can't thrive and are not encouraged to thrive. We see that Section 12J of the Income Tax Act is falling away, and it was originally intended to encourage investment in new ventures. How will you encourage entrepreneurs and small business to grow in the absence of additional tax incentives for this? Then it was mentioned that the corporate tax rate will be lowered after April 2022, but this is on the back of limiting interest deductions and assessed losses. This is extremely vague. My question is then, where are the details of these trade-offs? Because that's what they are, given the significant impact that they will have. Then thirdly, on the retirement fund reform, Minister, you mentioned that Regulation 28 will be amended to make it easier for retirement funds to increase investment in infrastructure. This is money that government clearly wants. Now, we all know that pension funds actually belong to the members and that it is their money. There have been calls for members to be able to leverage their own money to their own benefit, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. What progress is being made on members being able to leverage their own pension fund asset to their own benefit, such as a limited early withdrawal or a broader loan arrangement beyond just a home loan? And then finally, my question on the bailouts to the state-owned enterprises and high government borrowing, that is crowding out service delivery of basic services to the people. If we look at the numbers, that is what is happening, including in the social spending arena. Is there an upper limit to the bailouts, or will these continue unabated? Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Dr. George. Honorable Lewis.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, colleagues, and Minister and team from the Treasury. Let me first say, before I answer my questions, that I think it was an extremely difficult year in which to present a budget and a very dangerous time for South Africa fiscally and financially. And I want to congratulate the Treasury team and the Minister for achieving a sense of being able to avoid a debt crisis in incredibly difficult circumstances and sticking to his guns on debt control. That is certainly to be celebrated, and I think the whole team deserves thanks for that. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there weren't aspects of the budget that we are very critical of, and I think that the decision for the very far below inflation increase in social grants is an indefensible decision, given what my colleague, Dr. Dion George, has just said about the bailouts, to prioritize yet more bailouts over and above the living needs of the most vulnerable in our society, I think is indefensible and was a very poor decision. I must say, I find it quite a very big surprise and quite inexplicable, but I think says much about the priorities of government. The result, of course, is that the poor in South Africa are getting poorer as a result of below inflation increases and the 27 cents per litre increase in the fuel price, which disproportionately affects the poor rather than the middle class in society. And we've seen Africa is 585 Rand a month, and that line is getting further and further away for the poorest of the poor. Nevertheless, the minister was asked about the social grants decision yesterday. I don't expect him to, he defended it there. So you know, that is a matter now for debate. But I do have some questions. I'd like to know when the budget was signed off by the cabinet, because there's a couple of things missing from the budget book that were in the speech, and of course we also received the speech very late. So I'd just like to know if the minister can tell us when the budget was actually signed off by the cabinet. I've read the red book thoroughly overnight, and I'm it's a long document, so I'm sorry if I've missed it, but I find no reference to the reduction in the corporate tax rate in the red book. So I wonder if someone could just point out the reference to me, or explain why it isn't in the book, and what the revenue implications are of that. And just if you can just let us know if it was a late addition to the budget, why was it a late addition, and proposed by whom? And then, of course, really the underlying story of yesterday's budget, and the reason the numbers work, is because you are assuming this enormous 300 billion rand saving on wages. And really, if that saving does not materialize, then the budget itself does not materialize. So I just wonder if you can discuss that in some more detail. In particular, I'd like to know, the government has tried in the past the option of voluntary retirement, and that didn't work. There was little to no take-up of that early retirement offer. Is the government considering actual retrenchments, headcount reduction, and what is the actual procedure for effecting those? Has the Treasury considered or set out how that process will actually begin to work? And have you started discussions around headcount reduction, retrenchments in effect, with public sector unions? Thank you, Chair. If there's another opportunity, I have other questions.
Thanks, Honorable Lewis. Honorable Ryder, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Yeah, thanks to the Minister and the team from Treasury, and echoing Jordan's comments about the tough job you had. Yeah, I think well done, but. So I want to focus a little bit. Honourable Peters and Dr. George both touched on it. And yeah, the Minister said he's pretty sure we all have the budget review document in front of us. And if you do, if you can turn to page 19 of that, which in the little grey block has a figure which shows two scenarios where there's a deviation of GDP based on two different scenarios. And scenario B, which is the lower one, shows what happens if we have a couple more waves of COVID-19 spreading through our economy and causing similar havoc to what the first couple of waves have caused. So the truth is that the gap between scenario A, which shows a reasonable recovery, which I presume is what is going to result in our 3.3% growth, and scenario B, if we have the more waves, you see a much lower increase, and in fact contractions going forward. The gap between the two is in fact the cost of the failure to procure vaccines on time and to roll out the vaccines timeously. And this is the scenario we've already seen playing out. So in terms of that, my question really is, does the 3.3% recovery really reflect the current situation, noting that the vaccine rollout has not happened as we would have hoped to do, and no betting man, in fact no sane man or woman, or would bet against waves 3 and 4 coming and hitting this country later this year, because we haven't rolled the vaccine out in time. So in terms of that, is 3.3% really something we should be even talking about, or should we be aiming lower, noting that we're not going to make that kind of growth? The other point that I wanted to make is also from the same document on page 81, and it relates to the debt. The recovery from the debt situation. And on page 81, there are 3 risks to the finance strategy that are detailed. And the one is a widening budget deficit. which we're almost certainly facing, as I say, because of the fact that we're not going to make that 3.3%. The second risk is inflation and exchange rate risks, which again, we will almost certainly see once people see that our economy is not growing anywhere close to what other economies are growing at. And we were shown the slide comparing ourselves where, you know, even our quite hopeful 3.3 is substantially below other peers and other emerging markets even. And then the third risk is a sovereign credit rating further downgrade, which again, based on the recent notes, is almost a certainty. So there are three risks to the financing strategy. All three hold true. So, you know, it means we're in serious trouble. And I just wanted to know, in terms of that, what is the bond issuance strategy going forward? We know there's been quite an aggressive bond issuance in the past couple of months, and I think it's done reasonably well to stabilize things as they have. But we can't continue with that aggressive strategy going forward because it's becoming more and more expensive when you're looking at 10, 11, 12% bond yields. Chair, and I have more questions certainly on the fact that defense and the police seem to be the two hardest hit budgets, departments certainly, and the fact that that doesn't seem to be playing out in what the president is doing when he's deploying the SANDF in support of the SAPS, and the fact that there's so much reliance of them on them at this stage, and now we seem to be hamstringing them from their jobs. Perhaps we can get a comment on the fact that those are the two biggest budget cuts. Thank you, Chair, for now.
Thank you, Honorable Ryder. Honorable Taiso, over to you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Let me also take this opportunity to express our condolences to the family of Comrade Buthelezi after he has lost his sister. And we dearly express our deepest condolences to his entire family as this committee. Comrade Chair, I want to state outrightly that we welcome the budget presentation made by the Honorable Minister and his team. So my questions are, I just want to start where one of my comrade, Honorable Dipuo Peters has ended, just to highlight that South Africa is, some analysts argue that South Africa is a sovereign state that issues its own currency and only 11.9% of its debt dominated in foreign currencies. It has also a deep financial sector that had a total assets of about 15.9 trillion rands. 15.9 trillion rands at the end of December 2019. But then, as you are saying that that the financial sector has not been so much supportive towards a number of initiatives that the government is trying to do. So I think it's about time that now it has been dragging its foot. It has to be forced to be drawn to the match, so that its significance can be realized, because we cannot understand why they have a total assets of 15.9 trillion rands that they cannot, they fail to pull their legs towards the crisis that the economy is facing. Therefore, one would support the initiative, the question that both the private sector, the whole social partners have to, play this role that ensures that now there's a growth of the economy. Between 2013 and 2019, the GEPF, for instance, accumulated a surplus of 33.9 6.7 billion rands, unlike a private sector fund, which must be fully funded because it can go bust. There is no scenario where the GPF would have to pay all pensioners on the same day. So, so now there won't be such an event where we will see that happen. So now there will always be nurses and teachers to contribute to the fund. Since there is no reason for the GPF to be fully funded and accumulate such obscene surpluses in a country that has such high levels of poverty, has the government and social partners considered the possibility of drawing financial assets, e.g. the GPF, for instance? So that's one question that one want to get the clarity on. On the other issue, on the jobs, we have lost about 2.2 million jobs in 2020. We have only been able to recover 900,000 of that amount to date, meaning that in reality, we have lost 1.3 million jobs. This is the most notable amongst in the SME category. Is it not time that we start to look at how both fiscal and monetary policy should be more mutually reinforcing in bringing about a stimulus for growth in the economy? On the infrastructure, Chairperson, we would like to welcome the ongoing infrastructure commitments, which are major part of economic recovery plan. Our oversight work has revealed that much of the infrastructure that supports the economy requires maintenance and replacement. The budget responds to this in committing 791 billion rand in an infrastructure investment program. Yet the budget review states that the government does not have sufficient resources for the rollout, and therefore the private sector is being sought out to assist in this process. Beyond commitment, do we have certainly the funds from the private sector will materialize on the scale required? Last question, Chair, last two. On local government, we are aware that the financial governance remains a challenge for many municipalities. Money that is owed to municipalities and money owed by municipalities. Extending the municipal systems improvement grant is welcomed. But is this going to be enough to deal with the annual recurring unfunded monies that local government assists with? On fiscal consolidation, the Minister of Finance has in previous budget used the ALU Forex, a better testing plant, as the metaphor of government fiscal policy approach, while the president in his SONA used the symbol of Fein Boss, a plan that raises after a failed fire. In the light of the shocking 32.5% official unemployment rate announced by Statistics South Africa on Tuesday, which represents a 1.7% increase in the fourth quarter, the situation appears to be closer to the president's symbolism of a failed fire. Why didn't the National Treasury make more significant allocation to employment creation beyond the presidential job stimulus, which are effectively temporary public works programs? So otherwise, the ANC welcomes the funding of vacancies on a large scale, which was announced by the minister. However, the numbers presented by the minister in the budget yesterday suggest that there is no much mobilization of resources on the scale required to accelerate recovery, and even less to promote reconstructions towards a more dynamic, equitable, inclusive economy. How would the minister respond to the charge by analysts, particularly from the progressive movement, that the budget falls back on austerity paid for mostly by the poorest citizens? I thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Honorable Kaiso. Honorable Abraham.
Thank you, Chair. Let me thank the opportunity to be able to say something on the budget. So let me start off by saying that much as we appreciate the input from National Treasury, we note as well that your team DG today is a men's only team, and I was looking forward when the minister was calling upon Mamko, and I thought, there comes a woman. I'm just saying, DG, I hope that the representation today does not reflect what is pertaining in National Treasury, because I know that sometimes you do come with your women's only team. Coming to the budget, you know, as a team finance, we want to really appreciate the budget as it was presented yesterday. But of course, when it comes to issues of finance, we cannot be completely satisfied. We have a few issues to raise. My take, for example, in this instance, is around the issue of the money that has been pumped into the vaccination program. I am completely thrilled by that. However, Chairperson, for me, the transversal and oversight function of the finance department comes in here, because my view is that we then have a duty to ensure that vaccination rolls out in all areas of our country. This, for me, says there should be some working relations between National Treasury and Health. Quickly, let me go to the issue that has already been raised about what the proposal is for basic education. Remember, Chair, that in his State of the Nation address, the President did indicate that we need to regain lost time and improve educational outcomes. Now, the budget review indicates that low compensation growth of 0.8% over the MTF period and early retirements will reduce the number of teachers, and with rising numbers of learners, this implies larger classes, especially in the no-fee schools, which will negatively affect the learning outcomes, contrary to what the President pronounced. Chair, this reflects a cause and effect relationship, which can in part be attributed to the budget. Can we have a comment on this? When it comes to social development, Chair, the budget review states this function is aimed to reduce poverty and inequality by providing social welfare services and grants. Chair, the total social grant spending has been reduced by 5.8 billion in 21-22 and 10.7 in 22-23 and 19 billion in the year 2023-24. This is for the first time in more than a decade. Now, all grant values will increase by less than inflation, whilst the number of beneficiaries are expected to increase by 300,000 over the same period. Chair, the Minister announced social grant increases that were less than 3.34 inflation rate, which means that people will have less money in their pockets over the 3-year period after taking into account inflation. Chair, as you correctly know, grants are in effect increasing by 1.6. Old age, disability, and care dependency grant will increase by 30 rands to 1.8. Child support by 30 rands to 4.6, and so on. Why did Treasury opt for these below inflation increases, given the fact that many families depend on grants to survive? According to Statistics SA's 2019 report, over 55.5%, this is almost 30.3 million people, of South African population is living in poverty at the national upper poverty line. What measures are in the 2021 budget to address the extreme levels of poverty, hunger, and destitution? Quickly, Chair, coming to the public sector wage. The proposed 303 billion cut over 4 years for public sector will lead to a lower demand side push in the economy and not result in the intended growth that is needed. Further, this frames the way for the lowering of the morale in the public sector, especially since performance management, something that is needed and is a collective bargaining matter, being cut out. The likelihood, Chair, of skills leaving public sector is a real prospect. We are supposed to be building social cohesion, and the proposals are likely to do just the opposite. Can we have a comment on this one? Chair, members have spoken a lot about economic growth. My slight clarity is, how will the country increase GDP growth to create fiscal sustainability while Treasury plans to withdraw about 300 billion from the economy during the next 3 years? I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Abraham. Honorable Mrolo.
Well, thank you very much, Chairperson. Let me too join colleagues in commending the Minister, the DM and the DG and the entire National Treasury team for a commendable budget under the most difficult of circumstances. Now, Chairperson, let me also preface my questions by indicating that I may have lost connectivity during the briefing. And therefore, it's possible that some of the issues may have been touched on. Now, the first question is that according to the knowledge of the Minister, will the private medical aid contribute to the purchase of vaccines for their members as well as for the citizens not covered by the medical aid as a form of social solidarity? The second question is that the infrastructure fund has been budgeted for at about 4 billion. Can the Treasury indicate to us where this 4 billion has been allocated to and how the funding will be leveraged to increase infrastructure investment in the country? On the public sector wage bill, does the Minister believe that we can hold a line of increases in the wage bill of about 1.2% for the next 3 years? What does Treasury feel? What is the view of the Treasury with respect to the notion that there should be a special allocation, at least to health and frontline workers who have carried us through this crisis? And maybe the final question, Chair, is has the State Bank and the Sovereign Wealth Fund been budgeted for? If not, why not? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Mrolo. Honorable Okam.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Honorable Minister, thank you very much, and also to the team of Treasury. Honorable Minister, I always thought that being an undertaker must be the worst job in the world. I think at this stage you are beating undertakers. I think really you've got the worst job in the world at the moment. Honorable Minister, you last year said that our budget does not leave room for any mistakes. There are no room to do things wrong. We need to do things right. If you look at what we have been presented with now, it says that the fiscal policy concentrates on a few things, one of which is debt stabilization. Our gross debt to GDP is projected to stabilize at 88.9% of GDP in 25-26. Our current debt service cost is 960 billion rands over the medium-term economical framework. It is the third largest spending item by function in our budget. Now, if we are going to have room for mistakes, or if mistakes are going to be made, that amount will grow. This budget that you presented to us does not leave any room for any mistakes. Therefore, I want to commend you on one thing that you did over the last week. In a parliamentary written question that I wrote to you, in which you answered me with regards to the Reserve Bank's nationalization, you came last week and you confirmed that the government will not nationalize the Reserve Bank, and you gave certain reasons why, and that are some of the reasons that we as the Democratic Alliance posted to you over the last few years. So I commend you on that. That is one of the steps that walks in the right direction of creating stability. If you look at our budget deficit at the moment, it is 14% of GDP. You say that it will narrow to 6.3% of GDP in 23-24, and that we are on track to achieve a fiscal surplus in 24-25. Again, to achieve this, as well as to achieve the gross debt to GDP ratios, we cannot afford to make any mistakes. Now, I want to then come and maybe touch on the political side of this, but this is what it is about. We cannot make any mistakes, but yet we are still bailing out state-owned enterprises. Government is still doing and pursuing its expropriation of land without compensation that we all know led to downgrades. And we know that downgrades will make that we pay higher interest rates and that we obtain debt at higher cost, which will in turn take services away from our people. Isn't it high time that you said yesterday that there are certain stuff that are above your pay grade, but isn't it high time that you and your ministry do stuff that are within your pay grade? And stuff that are within your pay grade is to advise government on what will be to the detriment of our country. I am quite sure that if we create an environment that is conducive for investment, it will lead to job creation, it will lead to lower debt cost, it will improve our economy, and it will help us to maybe achieve what you have set out here to do. To give you an example, Operation Vlindler says that you say there that you will be reviewing the regulatory framework and processes that make it difficult to import scarce skills. My opinion is to look at it from a different way and say that if government stop the implementation of their draconian BEE policies, we will not lose our own people that might have some of those skills, and we will keep them here. To give you one example, Mr. Edgar Sishi says on slide 19, a financial position of public entities remains weak as a consequence of poor financial management. What will you do as a minister and your ministry to assist in making sure that we don't make those same mistakes in our public enterprises, our failing state-owned enterprises? You are the guy that's carrying the purse. Surely there must be some sort of an incentive for good work and some sort of a penalty for bad work. But we cannot keep on bailing out state-owned enterprises. Let me give you an idea. Our biggest threat at this stage is this COVID virus. Yet, the amount of money that you have made available over a 2-year period for the distribution of vaccines is less than what has been given last year to the SAA. Last year, SAA received 12 billion, I'm rounding my figures, and you are giving far less than that over a 2-year period for the distribution of vaccines. Surely that cannot be. Honorable Dipuo Peters touched on this, and that is that we get these figures, but they are always a downward adjustment. So I don't know how this will be achieved if we are not going to put stuff in place to prevent those downward adjustments. Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson. I would like to get some clarity on that, and all of the best for the Honorable Minister in implementing and hopefully achieving this. Thank you.
Honorable Chabalala, over to you.
Hello, Chairperson.
Mangwen.
Hello, Chair. It's Lubabalo, Chairperson.
Oh, have we lost Chabalala?
He has logged out, Chairperson, because there is a house sitting in the legislature, Chair. But his question is on the chat box. I don't know whether you want me to try and read it, or maybe let's assume that colleagues from National Treasury are able to capture it, and then you can just move to the other members.
Yeah, no, I think they are able to see it on the platform. Let's move to Honorable Sarupen.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Chair, just with regards to the presentation received today, during the course of the presentation, it was stated that tax increases were penciled in, but then they decided to walk back on them. I'd like to know, in the interest of transparency, what tax increases were planned, and is that still coming over the medium term, apart from the excise duties and fuel levy? Were there any personal income tax increases that were considered, that was planned? Is it coming over the medium term? What is the actual future around taxes and tax increases? Then secondly, I'd like to know what steps National Treasury is taking with regards to price benchmarking for goods and services, because cost escalation in the procurement of goods and services is actually beginning to become a critical problem for the state, considering the extremely constrained fiscal environment that we're in. And we can't have situations where SOEs are paying 20 Rand for a bottle of water, for example. So what are they going to do for that, and what are they going to do to ensure that there are caps or to make sure that procurement happens at a reasonable price? And this goes to my next question, which is around improving the multiplier effect of state expenditure. Currently, analysts say that for the point for every Rand taxed out of the economy, state expenditure then only has a multiplier effect of up to 60 cents. So that currently we're not getting a good multiplier effect out of the state. And I'd like to know what steps are going to be taken to massively improve that multiplier effect. And this goes to price benchmarking and cutting leakage in the system. Then I'd like to know from Treasury, considering that, and this has been touched on before, that the state has missed its revenue projections and targets consistently over a very long period of time now, will the state be able to avoid a fiscal cliff if it misses its debt projections, if its growth projections, and its revenue projections over the next 3 years? How close is it going to be getting if it misses its projections for growth? And then my last question, Chair, because this happens fairly frequently financial year after financial year, is it the intention this financial year to empty out the contingency reserve again for SOE bailouts, as has been done previously time and time again? And then it's snuck in through an adjustment budget or emergency circumstance. And I'd like to know what the intention is for this year's contingency reserve. Does it exist just to be used as a bailout later, or is it actually going to be used as a contingency reserve this time? Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Sarupen, and honorable members who have raised questions and comments. Honorable Minister, I've
raised my hand. I think it's still
okay. Honorable, okay. There's Honorable Njandu, Honorable Shibambu, Honorable Peters. These are the last 3 hands now. The minister responds with his team. If there will be follow-up, members will indicate. Honorable Njandu and Honorable Shibambu and Peters.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you very much, honorable members. I will only have one question to the minister and also to National Treasury. To welcome first the presentation from the minister and the deputy minister and Treasury. Chairperson, my question will be around the NSFAS. The Minister of Higher Education, when he spoke about the NSFAS funding for 2021, he stressed out that there will be a shortage in terms of the NSFAS, but the minister did mention yesterday around NSFAS. I just want to check whether will it be catering for sufficient for the 2021, so that we don't have the previous challenges that we had in terms of the NSFAS. I think, Chairperson, that's my question. Thank you very much.
Enkosi, Honorable Njandu, Honorable Shibambu.
No, thank you very much, Chairperson. We're going to make some few observations in relation to the budget that has been presented yesterday. You know that our overall observation is the fact that the design of South Africa's economy and budgeting thereafter fails to respond to the structural deficiencies of South Africa's economy. The very fact that we've got an economy that has got is not as industrialized and is not based on an expanded manufacturing sector. And that is a sector that is mostly responsible for economic growth. In the budget that has been presented, in the details of it, the allocation for the department that deals with industrial policy has been reduced by 1.3 billion rand. It's in the numbers that National Treasury has dealt with. And that is problematic because the only way to deal with the debt crisis is to expand the economy, the productive economy, broadens the revenue base, and then we're able to meet the debt obligations. Fiscal consolidation and austerity have never been a mechanism to stabilize debt anywhere in the world. There is no scientific illustration anywhere in the world that says that fiscal consolidation can make you meet your debt obligations in the manner that it is. And we'll illustrate just now that effectively we are still in an austerity budget. Whatever can be said by the Minister of Finance, we are still in an austerity budget. Now, the issue is that for you to drive a proper industrial expansion economy, you need energy stability. You need the stability in terms of the supply of electricity in a manner that it is. But the recent past history has illustrated that the independent power producers have not contributed to energy stability in South Africa. They've instead worsened the financial crisis of Eskom because the amount of money that Eskom is paying to independent power producers for electricity costs per unit is far much higher than what they do in terms of their own internal generation. I think that we might need to have a separate session, Chair, to look into the fiscal costs and burden of IPPs on Eskom, because if we do not stabilize Eskom, we're going to have a permanent crisis, a perennial crisis of no reliable and dependable energy sources, and that has got a direct impact on industry and therefore economic growth that is much needed to expand the revenue base, create jobs, and thereafter defeat poverty. That is one issue that we must look into as one of the issues. But also we need to get a proper discussion, and of course it cuts across on this intention to decommission coal as a source of energy. We understand, and all of us agree that we need to have renewable energy. We should reduce the carbon emissions. But there is now scientific evidence that is coming from CSIR that you can continue to use coal as a base load, but then utilize the clean coal technologies, a variety of them, which have been domestically developed here in South Africa, that can continue to use the natural resources, which is in abundance here in South Africa, to produce energy, because renewable energy forms that are being implemented in South Africa are not dependable sources of energy. And anyone who claims that such is the case is not telling the truth, is a liar in the manner that it is. And then we must then be able to deal with that differently. I want to ask a question in terms of the debt, the loan which you took from IMF of 100 billion, almost like all the loans that have taken amount to 100 billion, but your debt obligations are about above 200 billion. Like debt servicing costs are above 200 billion. And then you go and borrow 100 billion. aren't you borrowing money from the IMF to pay your debts, like, and even have much more bigger debt obligations? What is the logic in borrowing 100 billion when you know that annually you have to pay 200 billion in debt servicing costs that that happen? And then you have said that you're going to allocate 10 billion rands for the procurement of vaccines. How much vaccine are you going to procure with 10 billion rands? So, because you would possibly know now, because we have already paid for the vaccines that came and later on are going to expire in April. You have paid for vaccines that are coming from Johnson & Johnson, that are delivered, parts of them. So you will then be able to know that how much vaccines are we going to buy with 10 billion rands, because we cannot just celebrate the figure of 10 billion without knowing just how much coverage are we going to have from that particular 10 billion, so that we then are able to then determine and assess this properly. Because you might find that 10 billion is inadequate or is an over allocation. We do not know now, because we do not know what is the cost of vaccines. The National Treasury, which is responsible for paying of these vaccines, has not disclosed that. The Department of Health is relying on the NDAs to avoid the necessary accountability in that particular regard. But also, are we going to comply with procurement policies in terms of the procurement of vaccines? And your procurement policies now, they basically emphasize price as the main determinant of who must supply what form of vaccines. It cannot just be a political decision that we're going to take Johnson & Johnson vaccines vis-a-vis Sputnik V from Russia, or vis-a-vis whichever vaccine that comes from other parts of the world. If these vaccines have been scientifically proven to be effective, we need to then apply the price mechanism in this particular context, so that we use the little resources that we have to bring as much vaccines as possible into South Africa. So the procurement policies have to be complied with. I don't think this must even be a question. It must be an instruction that is given to National Treasury, that in the procurement of vaccines, we need to look into our procurement policy so that we derive value out of the vaccines that are going to be procured. Now, in the overall budget and the MTEF that has been presented here, the overall expenditure, the consolidated expenditure, is going to be reduced by 65 billion rand in the 2021 to 2022 budget, by 90 billion rands in the 2022-2023 budget, and by more than 140 billion in the 2023-2024 budget. That is budget reduction. It's part of the fiscal consolidation austerity measures that are being implemented by National Treasury. So we must not be misled to think that because nominally the figure of 200 billion sounds too huge, you then say, no, there's no fiscal consolidation, there is no austerity because the number is higher. Once you start reducing the government expenditure with the purpose of trying to meet your debt obligations, that is austerity. It's basic textbook knowledge, which I thought people who claim to be economists will understand and know. And what is tragic about this is that even the IMF, which is the godfather of austerity measures and fiscal consolidations, has come to the realization and acknowledgement that such methods of resource management and budget allocation does not bring about the necessary growth in the economy, does not help in terms of dealing with the developmental and poverty challenges that confront society. How do you, for instance, decrease social grants allocations? What is going to happen when the numbers of recipients are inevitably going to increase? What is going to happen in terms of that? So, because if you increase social grants by below inflation rates, you are effectively reducing the value of the amount which you are giving to social grants recipients, to grannies, to everyone else there. There's also a reduction in the education allocations, meaning that a lesser number of students are going to be allowed entry into institutions of higher learning because of this fiscal consolidation, which you are denying without any scientific value in terms of what happens. Those are our immediate observations, Chair. We'll discuss the details and expose the right-wing neoliberal budget of National Treasury when we then deal with the debate later on. There's no amount of childishness that is going to scare us from exposing the fact that this is an austerity budget which is not going to grow the economy. You are in the process of even decreasing the meager and insignificant allocation that was made onto industrial policy and industrialization. That has to change if we are serious about expanding the economy, broadening the revenue base, and meeting our debt obligations. In the manner that the budget is presented now, it is of no value to South African economy and therefore society for developmental purposes. Thank you, Chair.
Chairperson. Chairperson, can I come in? Chair.
Yes, Comrade Judy.
Can I come in, Chairperson?
Thank you, Honorable Peters. I will come to you. I was just saying that, Honorable Shibambo, I welcome your debate. I mean, your input. It's just that the part where you said there is a childlessness in the manner in which the minister has presented or briefed us is unparliamentary and should not actually be used from time to time when we are discussing at a committee level. The other part we accept, but the childless part is unacceptable.
That's fine. Fine, Chair.
Honorable Shibambu.
That's fine, Chair. Let's withdraw that, but also can we ask for a quick report on the State Bank, on the Sovereign Wealth Fund? I know that has been asked already. And on the position of National Treasury on the nationalization of the Reserve Bank.
Okay. No, thanks for withdrawing the childless part and accept the three other questions that you have asked now on top of what you have raised before. Honorable Depot Peters, over to you. Then allow the minister and the team to respond.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson. This is just in conclusion to indicate to the minister that we really, as African National Congress, appreciate the fact that you have also allocated an amount in the contingency reserve for the vaccines, because I would believe that for us to reach, and as a country to reach the about 67% vaccination rate, we would need that type of assurance that there is something put aside to be able to cover if there are shortfalls in the budget that has been provided. But I also want to say to you, Chairperson, we need to appreciate the fact that through the budget to COCTA and the DPW, the Minister, the National Treasury has put money for funding the Community Works Program and the EPWP. I want to thank you for this intervention, because you know, when you go into our communities and see the number of, especially the unskilled, unemployed people, this type of program does cover those type of people. And I would believe that what we need to do now is to focus on how better to use this number of people as opposed to them just be a cutting grass and all those. They could be a resource for cleaning hospitals, for cleaning schools, and etc. But we also want to say to the minister in conclusion, Chairperson, that the analysis that has been done, or according to the analysis that was done, it is highly unlikely that the fiscal consolidation path can be achieved by a public service wage freeze alone, without a reduction of the personnel, particularly in education and the criminal justice system and defense force. But we know that it is not going to be possible, that because the population is growing, the number of learners are growing, and COVID protocols in itself demand that the classes be separated so that less and less children can be in a particular class. So we understand that. Considering that the population is increasing, will the real value of the public service not decline in the medium term? Will the budgets for essential goods and services like textbooks, medicines, and maintenance of public infrastructure not come under increasing pressure? And Chairperson, I would believe that some of the questions that we want to raise, we will have to raise with the sector departments themselves when they come before this committee. But I want to thank the Minister for the budget under very trying conditions that you have been able to present before the people of the Republic. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Peters. Let me see. Okay, we're done with comments and questions. Over to you, Minister, Deputy Minister, DG, SARS Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me ask the team to answer some of the questions which really focus on the economic outlook. And in the economic outlook, the two key questions, Duncan, I'm sure you've got them. One is about whether we are going to see a V-shaped recovery from the contraction of 7.2% thereabout to a recovery of 3.3% in 2021, then tapering off to average around 1.9% in the outer years. You can deal with that. But the most fundamental part, Duncan, that you should deal with is the reliability or otherwise of our forecasting model. And whilst trying to answer that question, I think you should deal with the issue about forecasting in general, whether it's from the IMF, the World Bank, the South African Reserve Bank, the National Treasury, the Bureau of Economic Research, Stellenbosch University, or wherever. What is the nature of forecasting, and is it as accurate as that of a Sangoma, for example, and so on? So maybe we could talk about that, because I think there's a bit of misunderstanding about how you use the forecasting methodology as a tool. It doesn't give you it doesn't say precisely to the last dot. It's a tool. That's why in the central bank, we prefer in particular when we forecasting inflation to use the FEN chart, because it gives you a range of possibilities. But Duncan will speak about that. And then most importantly, I think for this committee, is a discussion of the fiscal framework, the revenue, expenditure, and the percentages of GDP, the real GDP numbers, and GDP at market prices, because based on the assumptions there and the forecast, we're then in a position to say, this is what we can spend or not. So technically, I'd like Edgar to respond to that. If I feel that he has not adequately responded to that, I'll return to buttress that. And then on the tax issues, Edgar can deal with that, or if Momo is on the line, Momo can deal with that. And I'll come back and indicate why the details, some of the detail on the tax policy and the tax announcement I made yesterday may not be in the big book. It's very easy to explain in terms of the process. And then we will then can conclude with some of the some of the questions, I'll deal with the questions about some of the theoretical and political issues around growth, private sector, investment, job creation, and whether you can force people to invest and create jobs or not is something that I'll come back to, and so on. So, guys, let's organize ourselves in the manner that I'm suggesting. Let's get the show on the road. We don't want to keep the members too long. I know you're also very tired, having been working overnight for many weeks, but let's get on the show on the road and be straight and perfect. I don't know whether Tsepiso and Mampo are on the line. They can also say whatever they want to say. Thank you very much, DG. Please, let's proceed.
We are on the line, Minister.
Yes, thank you, Minister. We'll start immediately. Just to Honorable Abrahams, I mean, just the small point which is important for the purpose of this meeting. Treasury has got 55% composition of women, and they also constitute a high percentage of the DDG. So in this meeting, Honorable, I've logged in, but I'm sitting in the same room with Tsepiso and Mampu, who are both DDGs for ALM and public finance respectively. Tsepiso will start with a number of questions that Honorable Shivambu asked also around how we manage our cash and debt vis-a-vis redemptions, etc.
No, DG.
And explain.
DG, no. I want us to go systematically as per in the book. Let's start with the economic outlook as I outlined, and go down like that, and then
that's fine. Minister.
Come to the fiscal framework. Edgar will deal with that. We'll come to the financing, and then Mampo Tsepiso can deal with that. We come to the spending plan, some of the questions, and Mampo will deal with that, and then I'll round up.
That's perfect.
Okay.
That's fine. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, Minister.
Okay, thank you, Minister, and Honourable Chair. As indicated by the Minister, I'll start with the questions around the economic outlook. And I think it's important to say, Honourable Peters, at the outset that economic forecasting or macroeconomic forecasting is challenging at the best of times, but it is particularly challenging when one is in the middle of a pandemic. And I think it's therefore important for forecasters like ourselves, the Treasury and others, to be very modest when we talk about our forecast. But having said that, I do want to add, Honourable Peters, that we are confident in the macroeconomic forecasting tool that we used. It has been benchmarked domestically and globally. And as we discussed last time when we were with the committees, there was a study done by the Parliamentary Budget Office, I think it was last year or the year before, where they actually looked at the accuracy of the National Treasury forecast, and the Parliamentary Budget Office concluded that our forecast is on par with, and in many cases better than, many of our peers. And I think it is important that is an independent view of our forecast, and it's important to to state that here. So we do have confidence in our model. The way the model works, of course, is that we take a range of assumptions about commodity prices, about global growth, about the fiscal framework and so on, and we feed it into a macro structural model that then gives us a macroeconomic forecast that informs the fiscal framework. And it gives us things like what to expect on GDP growth, what to expect on inflation, and so on. And then these variables then underpin Edgar's fiscal framework, or the fiscal framework of the national budget. And I think it's important, Honourable Peters, to talk about the 3.3% for our expectation for 2021, which you mentioned, and you mentioned in particular that it seems high. In fact, the 3.3 number is high in a slightly misleading way. And the reason I say it's slightly misleading is because all of our growth numbers are always a what we call a quarter-on-quarter number or a year-on-year number. So it's always relative to the previous year. And part of the reason the 3.3% seems high in historical terms is because, of course, in 2020, we expect the economy to contract by minus 7.2%. And if you have a very large contraction in 1 year, then your next year's number is bound to be higher than usual. And this is what economists call the base effect. And so a big part of the reason we have the 3.3 number in 2021 is due to this base effect. It's because we have this very large contraction of minus 7.2. And if one look beyond the growth rates and you look at the levels of GDP, you actually find that because of that minus 7.2% contraction, the level of our economy, in other words, the size of our economy, is much smaller than it was in 2019. And in fact, based on our projection, the economy will only get back to the place it was in 2019 in 2023. So that just shows us that while the 3.3% growth rate might seem high, the size of our economy actually is much smaller in level terms because of this very big contraction that we experienced in 2020 due to this due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is one way, I think, of explaining the 3.3%. The minister did ask that I talk a little bit to other forecasters and what they expect. So just to put our 3.3% in context, Honorable Peters, the Reuters does a survey of all the other forecasters in the country and what they anticipate for growth in 2021. And if you take an average of all of those forecasters, they actually anticipate a GDP growth number of 3.9%. 3.7% in 2021. So that 3.7% is actually higher than our 3.3%. And there are other forecasters like the Reserve Bank that anticipate GDP growth to be 3.6%, which again is higher than our 3.3%. So when one looks at our 3.3, it's always important to keep it in the context of what other forecasters are expecting. So some are expecting slightly less, some are expecting slightly more. The average of the Reuters economists is around 3.7. So while our 3.3% seems high, it is actually a very reasonable in our view. The expectation is very reasonable. And part of the reason these numbers are so different is because, of course, the pandemic has caused a lot of uncertainty. And that's why, coming back to the earlier point about the modesty, I think that is quite important. I know the minister said that you would talk around the question, Honorable Peters, that you had around why we can't grow and the drivers of growth. And the role of investment. So I will leave that to the minister to come back to later. I just wanted to respond specifically.
Duncan, you can speak about the growth enablers and also the high impact interventions, network industries and so on. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Minister. So, Honorable Peters, you asked why is our growth stuck below 2%, and why can't we get above this 2%? And as you rightly point out, this is sort of our potential growth of our economy just seems stuck at a very low level. And part of what we have outlined in previous budgets and part of what we talked to in this year's budget review in Chapter 2 are some of these constraints to our growth that keeps our growth levels below 2%. And if one looks at the actual drivers of growth, you will see that there are 2 or 3 main drivers of growth if we just ignore imports and exports for a moment. And that is household consumption, it's government consumption, and it's investment. And those are really the main drivers of growth. And of those 3, the 2 main drivers are actually household consumption and investment. And if we just peek into investment a little bit and try to unpack it, what we will find is that 70% of our investment actually comes from the private sector. So a major driver of our growth is investment, and 70% of that investment comes from the private sector. And that investment has actually been shrinking over time before the COVID pandemic. And so the question, of course, is, well, why has investment been shrinking? And part of the reason investment has been shrinking is because it is, of course, very difficult for manufacturing plants to expand their operations if there is uncertainty or unreliability around electricity, as an example. It is also very difficult for telecommunications companies, MTN and Vodacom, to invest in telecommunications infrastructure if there is no additional spectrum for them to use. It is also difficult for farmers to expand their farms if it is difficult for them to get a water use license, for example. And so part of the reason Operation Vlindler focuses on these network industries, water, transport, electricity, and so on, is because unless we make it easier for the manufacturing plants to get access to reliable electricity and to a port system that is efficient and on par with the rest of the world, they won't invest and they won't expand, and GDP will remain below 2%. And so what we really hope to achieve with Operation Vlindler is a situation where, through focusing on these binding constraints or these bottlenecks to growth, we can eventually raise growth to above 2%, to above 2% over time. And that links also, and I will end here, Minister and Honorable Chair, to Honorable Ryder's question about the scenarios on page 19 of the book. And we have 2 scenarios there. And the reason we put forward these scenarios is because, as the Minister said, we publish a baseline growth forecast that underpins the fiscal framework. But of course, it is very difficult to know what will actually happen. And so the job of the scenarios is to tell us what are some of the alternative futures that we may need to be thinking about. And one of those is scenario A, which in fact, Honorable Ryder, is not the scenario that gives you the 3.3%. So scenario A is what we call an upside scenario. So this scenario actually in 2021 gives you 3.6%, not 3.3%. And this is the scenario that shows what is possible for economic growth if we implement some of the reforms, particularly in the network industries that I spoke about earlier. If we improve the efficiency of our ports, if we improve the reliability of our electricity system, if we make it easier for farmers to get water use licenses, and in that way start expanding investment, then our GDP growth can in fact go higher than the 2% that it has been stuck at. So that's really what scenario A says in that on page 19. The horizontal line there, Honorable Ryder, is actually the baseline forecast. That is the 3.3%. And the line below it, the red line, is what we call a downside scenario, which is what would happen if there are additional waves of the pandemic and what that might mean for economic activity. And just to close up on this point, part of the reason we put forward that as a scenario is because it's very difficult to say what kind of restrictions to economic activity might be associated with any future waves. And we also don't know how many waves are left. We don't know the intensity of those waves. But we had to, in order to frame our thinking about the economic outlook, we had to think about, well, what if there are additional waves, and what would that potentially mean for our macro forecast? and therefore for our fiscal framework, which is why we put those scenarios forward. Minister, I will leave it there and hand over to Edgar on the fiscal framework issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So on the fiscal framework, the slide presentation showed the fiscal framework on a consolidated basis. I would call honorable members to, if you want more detail, if you look at chapter 3 of the budget review, in particular table 3.7, it shows the fiscal framework on a main budget basis. In other words, the fiscal framework not including the social security funds and the public entities. The framework, whether you do it on a consolidated basis or you do it on the basis of the main budget, is divided essentially into 3 broad components. The one is the revenue of government, which is essentially mostly the tax revenues of government. Then the spending, which is then subdivided between what the government spends in terms of allocations plus the contingency reserve. And then the other part of spending is debt service costs. Now the revenue minus the spending is the fiscal balance, which can either be in deficit or in surplus. As I indicated in my presentation, the balance has been in a deficit or negative position for many years. Both the main budget balance has been in deficit, and also what we call the primary balance has been in deficit. The primary balance is the spending minus the revenue minus the spending, excluding debt service costs. In other words, it's the fiscal balance that is dependent on the policy decisions of the government. And that balance has been in negative territory as well for more than a decade. And so when we think about fiscal policy, we obviously start with the revenue. And if you look at both the, revenue, both on the consolidated or on the main budget balance, basis, the revenue in the current year really falls down. You can see the decline in revenue. Main budget revenue this year, the year ending next month, is projected to be 1.2 trillion rand. But as a percentage of GDP, that translates to about 24% of GDP. Now, last year, we collected more than 26% of GDP's worth of revenue, as colleagues both in tax policy and the commissioner will talk about revenue, I'm sure, in a moment. But we collected about 26. So we've seen a big downturn in revenue in the current year. Now, there's going to be a bit of a recovery. But because of the dynamics that Duncan just explained, that even though there's a recovery, the actual economic activity in the country is only going to return to what it was before over a number of years. In fact, it'll take probably 4 years for it to get back to where it was. What that means is that the tax revenue recovery is equally going to take a while to get to the place where it was. Which means that when you are thinking about the second part of the framework, which is the expenditure part, it's clear that you do not have scope to decide to increase expenditure on a permanent basis in this framework. If you believe that your revenue improvements will take a very long time to actually happen, it is irresponsible to permanently raise the level of spending when you are in that kind of revenue situation. Now, the fiscal deficit has been in negative territory for a long time. In other words, we have been spending far more than we get from revenue for a very long time. It's not a phenomenon that has showed up this year. And so what that implies is that the deficit has become structural in nature. And we need to take tough measures in order to begin to close it, because if we don't close it, that deficit implies increasing debt levels for government. And that debt incurs interest, and that interest is growing. This year, that interest is going to be more than 230 billion in 1 year. And over the MTF, as I indicated, the interest is going to be more than 900 billion rand. Now, the more the interest increases, because interest by its very nature is a first charge, you have to pay it. You can't not pay the interest on your debt. The more that interest increases, the more it crowds out other spending obligations of government. The less money you have to put into education, the less money you have to put into health, the less money you have to put into social development, and so on and so forth. So it is critical, if you really want to protect service delivery, if you really want to protect the spending priorities of government, you cannot allow the interest bill to continue growing permanently. And that is what our fiscal strategy is about. Reducing the interest bill by closing this fiscal deficit that has been there for a very long time, so that we don't have a situation where we have these permanent spending reductions across all of the different elements of government. It's not just social grants, it's all of the different parts of government which are experiencing reductions, and it is because of this unsustainable debt and debt service cost situation. The last point I just want to make, which was also raised about fiscal multipliers, is that this, or second last point, is that this budget is aimed at addressing precisely this issue of fiscal multipliers. Because we have determined that much of the budget, too much of the budget over the last decade or so has been spent on items with low multipliers, right? In particular, consumption spending. And so this budget shifts the focus on, shifts the focus of spending from that towards higher multiplier spending, such as infrastructure. Indeed, even in the short term, the spending decision that we have made in respect of the vaccine is an example of shifting towards a high multiplier spending, because vaccine spending is going to lead to an opening up of the economy because of a reduced reliance on lockdowns, and that's going to have much bigger spin-offs on economic growth and economic activity than spending on consumption. And in that respect, the contingency reserve that we have set aside and increased is specifically there to deal with those emergencies, mostly the emergencies arising from COVID-19, in order to fund any shortfalls in the vaccine rollout. So part of the money is obviously given to the Department of Health, but part of the money is the contingency reserve to deal with those unforeseen costs arising from vaccine rollout, but also arising from any other pressures as it relates to the pandemic itself. And in addition to that, other emergencies that are unforeseen, particularly things like natural disasters and so forth. So that is why the contingency reserve is there, and that is explained in Chapter 3 of the budget review. Thank you.
Chair, if I may come in on the text proposals.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Minister and Chair and honorable members. Good afternoon. I think just in terms of the questions that were asked on text, let me just say, Chair, that a few years ago, I don't know why the practice stopped, but soon after the initial budget hearings, we would have a dedicated day for all the text proposals. And I think we would welcome if we could have a day, because there's a lot to talk about, a lot of trends to show. And if we leave it now, then we only come really when we do the TDAP and rates bills. Let me make also the point that on budget day, as we normally do, we also publish the rates and monetary thresholds bill. So it is on our website, which deals mainly with the rate and threshold changes. And we also this year have published the draft financial services levies bill, which outlines the levies that financial institutions will pay towards the costs of their regulation to the Prudential Authority and the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. Chair, let me say that just on the question on Regulation 28, The Gazette for this, asking for public comment, will be published tomorrow, and it largely deals with how, as you know, with pension funds, enabling them to invest for infrastructure. Again, it's not a forced, it doesn't force them to, it kind of just enables the trustees to do so, and there's at a higher level and through different ways. So that will be published tomorrow, we've been told. On the question on withdrawals, since I'm dealing with pension funds, I think as the minister announced, there's quite a lot happening, starting with the annuitization measures, which start taking effect the 1st of March. There's quite a lot of discussions going on at NEDLAC, including the question of withdrawals. And Honorable George, I think just on the question of withdrawals, in principle, the minister has announced that we are open to some form of withdrawals, limited withdrawals, but it has to be linked to preservation. And we've been sitting with some of the stakeholders at NEDLAC to see how this is possible. We haven't cracked this problem yet. We're still engaging, and as soon as we complete that process, we will certainly bring it forward, possibly in legislation, because it will require legislation. But I want to emphasize, the issue is really to get people to save and preserve their savings and have very limited withdrawals, and also to get greater coverage. So those changes are in play. With regard to some of the specific announcements that were made, I think on Section 12J incentive, that is been removed. We have done a review of it, and largely we find that, and the Budget Review Chapter 4 does cover some of it, but we find that most of this was really taken up by those in the highest income brackets, and very little went towards investment. In fact, only 37% of the companies had added any employment after receiving this funding. And even the types of investment that, the tax break was for 11.5 billion rands for the period that we covered in the review. And only the investments were only about a third of that, 4.2 billion. And most of these were just in low risk ventures like property and rental and so on, rather than actually hard investment that generated lots of jobs. We don't think this is the only mechanism to support small businesses. We're open to looking at other options, but certainly this incentive, we believe, has not been utilized in the way that we had expected, and certainly didn't promote small businesses or create the number of jobs that we were hoping it would. With regard to the corporate income tax, the announcement that's been made covers the next fiscal year. Now, normally, that announcement would be made not even next year, it would be made in 2 years' time, in the 2023 budget. If you just go by the last time when we reduced the corporate income tax rate, which was, I think, in 2008. And basically what we find is that, or what we wanted to do was just to signal the future path. The problem we face is that in the last few years, both the UK and last year or year before, the USA reduced their corporate rates significantly, and we are quite an outlier. Now, we are not just reducing the rate, we're doing so in a tax neutral manner. And last year, we in fact linked it to limiting interest deductions and assessed losses. And we produced a discussion document last year. We wanted to put it in place for 2022, but with COVID, we had to slow down that process. And in fact, it's still work in progress, and we'll continue with the consultation. But we are saying we want corporates to continue to pay the same amount of tax that they paid, but do it more fairly between corporates by allowing a lower rate for all, which we think is a bigger stimulus towards supporting growth than, for example, only giving tax deduction to a few companies, which in any case often get abused from what we can see. And that's just the nature of how these things work. So that's as far as the CIT rate. So, and for that reason, because it only will take effect from next year and largely will be in 2023, effectively what it means is that the fiscal framework was not changed, and also because it's been done in a revenue neutral manner. For that reason, it was not put into the budget review book, but was meant as an announcement for the future. And we will take it up in the TLAB when we are dealing with those assessed losses and interest deductions. Let me just see what the next question was. In terms of increases on taxes, you know, it might seem a long time ago, but basically, except for at the start of our democracy soon after 1994, there was one small increase. Generally, our tax rates have gone down. And the compact we had with taxpayers was that if we can broaden the base, we will reduce the rate for everybody. That's what we're doing with the corporate income tax, and that's what we want to do with all our taxes. It's only in 2015 that we started increasing taxes because of the problems, firstly at SARS, not getting revenue with all the problems we had with the previous commissioner, and the Nugent report has covered that. But basically, we started increasing personal income tax 1% for every bracket except the bottom one. We also increased the top bracket later to 45% for the wealthiest, and we found that the revenue take was not coming, presumably because very wealthy people know how to structure their way out of paying and to do it legitimately, so you can't in terms of the law. But this is a game like whack-a-mole. The moment, as you know, in tax, we have a provision, people then get the best minds to structure their way out. So it's something we have to keep in mind as we structure, because we do want, and we do recognize the question of, do high net worth individuals pay their fair share of tax, and how do we get them to do so? And I think for that reason, you've seen that SARS has announced that, you know, we're taking into account what the Davis Tax Committee pointed out about the difficulties with a wealth tax. But before we even do that, it's to actually collect wealth information. Bear in mind, SARS only collects your income information. And I think the commissioner can talk more about it, but that's the approach we take. So there was no actual intention to raise any tax. In fact, ideally going down, we'd want to continue to reduce taxes because revenue collection begins to improve, the economy begins to grow. Those are the issues that we're looking at. And for that reason, hence the approach taken on CIT. In terms of missing revenue forecasts over a number of years, again, you know, there's a number of reasons. Either it's related to growth, or it's related to, you know, either people have structured the issues and challenges that SARS faces. There's a number of those reasons, but I should add, and in fact, the biggest factor is economic growth. So with COVID, as you saw, I mean, we did not predict that COVID would impact on us in last year's budget as it did. We didn't even think lockdowns. And once you had the lockdowns, you had a huge decline in revenue, as Edgar has pointed out. And in fact, let me just point out to members that we will be collecting next year. We're projecting to collect just about what we collected, not in this fiscal year, but in the 2019-2020 fiscal year. In this time, our expenditure, so our revenue has been flat, even nominally, will be flat next year. But our expenditure still increases by almost 200 billion rand. So you can see that just how big the deficit becomes. And obviously my colleague Sapiso has to then go out and borrow from the markets. Minister, I think I've answered all the questions. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Momo. I will proceed where you left off. There was a question from Honorable Ryder talking about the strategy and acknowledging the risks that we are facing, which are true, and some of them have realized. And unfortunately, with the borrowing requirement of 770 billion rands that was forecasted last year, borrowing had to be aggressive, and it has contributed to higher borrowing costs. We have, at the current moment, been issuing about 24 billion on a weekly basis, which is quite aggressive. But I thought it would help if I just point you to table 7.2 in the budget. And it shows you the different instruments that we use to fund this deficit. And what we have done, Honorable Ryder, recognizing all those risks, we have tried to deal with, increasing our short-term loans significantly higher than we would normally do. We have also accessed our cash reserves that we had kept with the sub for quite some time. So if you look at table 7.2, if you look at the change in cash balances, you can see that in the upcoming years, what we are doing is using some of our cash balances to fund the budget balance, which also includes the redemptions as well, not just the interest cost. And that is trying to deal with some of the risks. We have limited our foreign currency issuance because of us not producing dollars and ensuring that we do not expose ourselves to currency risk. But we have also benefited from that funding when the market is good. So the funding strategy remains very uncertain and very challenged. And that is why in this budget review, we have shown a declining gross borrowing requirement. I think even though the budget deficit is coming down, what is impacting us the most is the fact that over the years, we have not been paying our redemptions, which are then coming due, which then increases the amount of which we require in order to finance those redemptions. I can just also move on to the question of Honorable Floyd, because it's tied to this question, and that's why we have gone out and diversified funding sources, including borrowing from the IMF. Yes, it's almost 100 billion, but our debt service cost at 269, and our redemptions even higher than that in some years, necessitates that we continue, unfortunately, to borrow in order to make sure that we do not default on our obligations. And these loans are coming at very reasonable rates with no conditions, and we keep saying that. The IMF loan came at 1% over 5 years for 4.3 billion. I can tell you, Honorable Floyd, that there is no market that would give you money for 1% in this current environment with the kind of risks that we are experiencing. And therefore, our ability to access this funding is very important. If I can also refer you, Honorable Floyd, to table 7.4 of the budget review, and also refer you to table 7.11. I think it's critical because these institutions, we are part of them. We pay subscription fees on a yearly basis to be part of them. And if we are not taking advantage of the kind of rates that they are able to lend us money to, then they will take the money that they have and deploy it to other countries at a cheap rate. So it's important that while we do put money into these institutions, we are able to leverage on the very same institutions for the funding that we require. But having said that, the issue of debt and debt sustainability is still an issue. Even though we are able to access markets, the risks are very high that at some point, if we continue in this trajectory, we might not be able to afford the debt that we keep piling. As I said, we have not been paying our redemptions, and we need to start paying back those redemptions instead of just managing them over time and hoping that will be able to generate enough cash to deal with those redemptions. The other question, potentially one last one from Honorable Kaiso on the deep liquid markets and financial sector not being supportive. Honorable Kaiso, I'm just going to give you some numbers. You've quoted some. For instance, the asset under management you quoted as of last year of about 15.5 trillion, 15.9 trillion rands. About 10 trillion is in the non-banking sector in asset management. About 6.6 trillion is in the banking sector. With the foreign savings declining, what we've seen is these local investors or asset under management being deployed to support the government, especially at a very, very difficult time. So the argument that the financial sector is not supportive and therefore must be forced, it doesn't hold if you're looking at the numbers. Yes, these asset under management are huge, but they're already deployed, and the growth rate. So if you compare the 2019 number to this year's number, or 2020, there's only an increment of about 1 trillion rand in asset under management. That is new money. And if you look at government funding requirement that reaches almost 700 billion, it means it leaves very little for any other players of the economy to be able to get funding in those form of savings and also invest. So actually most of this funding is already being deployed in the economy. So I would say we have seen a massive support of local funders in the bond auctions, especially at a time where the foreigners were selling our bonds because they were worried about our ability to repay our debt as we get downgraded and as the pandemic challenges increased quite significantly in the past year. So what has carried us through, Honorable Kaiso, would be the very financial sector that you were referring to, supporting the government in its mandate for service delivery. That is also a risk in a sense that, certain asset classes, there are regulatory requirements in terms of how much insurers or how much banks can hold in asset classes. So that is also something that we need to consider going forward, that they are not holding a lot of government debt, causing concentration risk that could ultimately cause a systemic risk in the banking sector or in the financial market. So those are some of the things that we consider when we look at what should be borrowed and whether the demand, can absorb the supply that we are bringing in the market. Minister, I'll stop there and allow Mampo to come through as well, cognizant of the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Tepiso. So, Minister, in terms of the political party funding, unfortunately, I can't share the screen because it must be shared by the host. But basically, what we're looking at is the fact that the Act establishes two types of funds. The represented political party funding, so that's the funding that the fiscals allocate funding for, and then the new fund was the multi-party democracy fund, where it basically would be private sector funding and consolidated private sector funding. So the aim of this Act, honorable members and minister, is that all the funding that sits in different places should be put in this one Act, in this one fund, so that there is transparency in managing this funding. This fund will be managed by the Electoral Commission, so they will be establishing a unit that will manage this fund. So up to now, we allocated 80 million as a startup to manage the fund. And if you look at the allocations from the fiscals, the funding will increase from 166.8 million in 21-22 all the way to 171.7 million in 2023-24. So this constitutes an increase of just under 2% for the funding. If you look at the multi-party democracy fund that has been set aside so far, there's just a pledge of 5 million, and I think the parties will start to basically market this funding so that they can get private sector funding. However, these are not the only funds, Minister, that political party gets. There's also an allocation that is done to Parliament, where there's support for where there's political party support. There's also constituency support as well as party leadership support. So I can send this presentation to the Secretariat and then they can share it with the honorable members. In terms of the Department of Health, Minister, and the funding of the vaccines from Honorable Shubambu. Basically, what we have tried to do is to cost how much is going to cost us to basically buy the vaccine. So in this year already, which is 2020-21, if honorable members picked up that Minister also tabled what we call a special appropriation bill, where we allocate funds to the Department of Health of 1.1 billion. And that was mainly because most of these bilateral agreements are signed in this current year. But going forward, the amounts that are in the allocation for the Department of Health are based on a model that we and or Treasury and the Department of Health worked on, and those are the preliminary numbers. But the developments of this pandemic changes all the time, and no one knows what's going to happen in the future. So we base our estimates on models that are helping us to model this. So all in all, what we're looking at is the fact that we think the funding that is allocated for now is sufficient, but if it's not sufficient, as Minister said, there is a contingency reserve that will be used to support the Department of Health if there's a need to do so. In terms of the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, we are already working with the Department of Higher Education to deal with the funding of NSFAS. In terms of social grants, basically, Minister and honorable members, from 2012, where we started reducing the budget or the growth in the budget, we made sure that social grants are protected. Even when we had to find 56 billion for fee-free higher education, we still managed to protect social development. But what we picked up now is that the need for consolidation and the fact that we need to deal with the budget deficit, it was a bit difficult to fully protect social development or the social grants. So we did look at the implication, and of course, I mean, we understand what a less than inflation increase means, but we tried to make sure that at least we do increase the social spending. And what will happen is that we're hoping that by doing good now, and consolidate will give us a leeway in the future. And if that happens, of course, social grants will be one of those spending items that we will be first to consider in terms of where we are. And of course, looking at things like the poverty line and other things. So I think what we try to do is balance between the need to protect the poor and also the need to consolidate and try to make sure that if we fix our problems now, we can have some leeways in the future. I'll stop here, DG and Minister and honorable members. Thank you.
DG, you want to say something before I conclude?
Thank you, Minister. We will stop here. Thanks.
Honorable members, I think that we've tried to give as comprehensive a set of replies as possible. You know, as we were going through the COVID crisis last year, we kept on coming to Parliament to keep Parliament informed about our thinking processes and also how we're adjusting our plans that we had in February. And one of the issues we had to do was also to consider the funding for SAA, and we had to come to Parliament to discuss that. So we had COVID on one hand, and we had SAA. With SAA, well, we don't agree whether it's a bailout or not, but that doesn't matter. It's a moot point, really. fact of the matter is that we had obligations from the business rescue practitioner that we had to make provision for in law, because we prefer to go by the rules of the law, and the law required of us to come to Parliament for that special appropriation for SAA to meet the obligations as required by the business rescue practitioners. And on the State Bank, a memorandum is on the way now to the cabinet, I understand, because the feasibility study has been done and everything else. And Dr. Masondo has been dealing with this, and he's just indicated to me that I should say that a memorandum is on its way to the cabinet. It's been concluded. I'm sure DG can confirm that. The other technical issues, I think, have been thoroughly, I think, ventilated by the Treasury team. But let me just deal with a few political questions, and then I'll close off with a policy matter. I think Honorable Hill Lewis asked the question, when did Cabinet sign off on the budget? To understand that, one needs to look into what is the process of designing the budget. Very briefly, it starts with the technical teams in the different departments working on requests which are being made for their budgets. Maybe DG, why don't you explain that? Maybe you explain it much better because you deal with it before I mess it up. Just the budget process, then I want to try and answer the question about when the signing off was done, but I want the process, including MINCOM.
Yes. No, let me do that. Thank you very much. Minister, every year around June, or even earlier, but this last time around, we issued budget guidelines in June. The budget guidelines essentially spell out key dates, spell out the assumptions that departments must use and entities must use in submitting budgets, and key dates in the process. The budget guidelines are issued on our website, and they're freely available for anyone to look at them. Within the budget guidelines, we indicate various functional group meetings, DG's forum meetings, including MTEC meetings, medium-term expenditure committee meetings, and budget in MINCOM BUD meetings, cabinet meetings, extended cabinet meetings, budget forum meetings, and budget council meetings, all of which have got an input in the budget process. All of the technical committee meetings, the political meetings are supported by technical committees that sit on a regular basis and engage. Now, departments in these various groupings, whether it's functional group where the security cluster will be grouped together, the social services cluster departments will group together, economic services, etc. They then submit budgets to MAMPOS teams in the National Treasury, to the Public Finance Division team, indicating in detail a database that spells out what exactly each department is going to do and what programs will be funded. Now, based on that, discussion between the team in chief directors in public finance, they will engage with the DGs in the different departments and escalate the matters where need be to the DGs forum that I chair with some of the DGs. And then finally, all of these are escalated to the medium-term expenditure committee meetings, Minister, where I chair. In there, who sits is the DG in the presidency, is the DG, DPSA, DG COPTA. And now we constitute that, including the DDGs in public finance. Now that's important because it is that committee that then finally make recommendations to the Ministers' Committee on the Budget based on what needs to happen. The Ministers' Committee on the Budget will, at least on a minimum basis, once the budget process is full swing, meet at least once a month until around the time of the budget is presented. Around September, October every year, before the medium-term budget policy statement, there is something called extended cabinet where premiers and MECs for finance are involved, and then the Budget Council make recommendations to this committee comprising premiers. And what do they look at? They look at the division of revenue, vertical division of revenue, the split. They look at key issues and key assumptions that would have been informed by the various makgotla, of the cabinet, and those makgotla then final recommendations to essentially the State of the Nation address that outlines key issues, that spells out what the president's intention is, what the ruling party intention is, and it would have found expression in what the minister would have said in October, which forms part of the budget process. Now, in terms of the dates and the timelines, one expects, which is normal and it does happen every year, that some issues will come even after the process, especially now in a strict environment like this. COVID was a classic example, where the medium-term budget policy statement was passed, and then the implications for COVID and the cost of vaccination comes immediately after that. It will then mean cabinet will have to meet, a special cabinet will have to be called for them to consider the budget. And finally, with various iterations in the process, meetings do happen. And in cabinet, by the way, ministers and minister and honorable members, we've got a standing item as finance, agenda item 5.1, which is the financial matters, where the minister of finance have the opportunity to raise any matter that is got to do. We have consistently this time around used that to inform cabinet of budget-related matters that impact on the budget process, that would have finally deadlines would have been missed as a result of more than many issues that come out after the budget has been sort of recommended by MINCOM. But and this time around, the same thing happened. As I said, COVID was a classic example. Now, in terms of timelines and dates as to when was cabinet, I think that it depends on what? It depends on what specific issue, because we have an extensive cabinet lekgotla where an extensive fiscal framework was presented. And we do indicate, by the way, that the final framework will be that one that's tabled on budget day, because there are various assumptions and irritations of the budget that come as a result. And cabinet and the process, as understood for the past many years, is that the cabinet understands that the broad aspects of the framework is what cabinet signs off. However, the key deficits will be finalized at the time of the budget. Now, tax policy matters. Tax policy matters are not an item for Ministers' Committee on the Budget, nor as the Medium-Term Expenditure Committee, because of the sensitive nature. The Minister of Finance and closely his team would deal with that, make recommendations, final recommendations to the President, and final recommendations to that last cabinet meeting before the budget is passed, in deciding what matters needs to be put forward and what matters need not to be put forward. So, Minister, I've outlined in a nutshell, but we've got it all. We can get it all written up and support, any members of the committees feel that want to explain more. We can make ourselves available to explain the budget process and even give dates and so on and so on. But I just thought, Minister, out of my head, I'm able to pick up things that were asked in an uncoordinated manner like that. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. I think you covered it very well, DG. You covered it very well. And if the chair of the committee feels there's a need for a write-up, that's fine. So the final sign-off for the cabinet was on Tuesday. Was it Monday or Tuesday, DG? Tuesday. I think
Minister, it was Tuesday, yes, Tuesday.
That was a final sign-off. But as the DG indicates, on the sensitive matters of the tax issues, particularly, say, the corporate income tax, the CIT, that had to be concluded eventually between the Treasury team, myself, and the President, given the sensitive nature of the matter. So that's how the process went. The issue of the private sector and investment is an ongoing debate, but I think Tsepiso has technically answered that. But can I put it before members that you can't say what is the Treasury doing to make the private sector invest. The Treasury cannot force the private sector to invest. Since it's a democracy, I can't call Anglo-American aside and say, you shall invest so much. you shall employ so many people. I can't do that. And in fact, nobody can do it in a constitutional democracy. What we do is to create the enabling conditions which encourage private agents, including the private sector, to invest. Private sector invests where it sees an opportunity. I was chairman of 3 listed companies before I joined the government. And I know what we go through, the investment committee. There's no way in which the investment committee will take orders from any political party or the government for that matter. But if they see a benefit for the company, its employees and other stakeholders, yes, they will expand investment, but you can't force them. And I think Duncan tried to indicate what some of the constraints are to investment. And I thought that I should take advantage of this to mention one extremely important factor that the private sector takes account of whether to invest or not. And that is policy certainty. If there's an uncertain policy environment, the private sector will not invest. Uncertain policy environment is very bad. And it creates a sense that capital starts looking for investment opportunities where there's policy certainty. And some of the things which are very important in the growth process, and I'm going to quote a study that was produced by Goldman Sachs in 2005. I must make a declaration that I used to be advised at Goldman Sachs before I came back to government. But in 2005, Goldman Sachs produced a study which was basically a summary of what are the factors which are critical for growth. And this, other members can take notes of. First one is macroeconomic stability. And macroeconomic stability involves some of the things that we've been talking about, which is low inflation, low government deficits, and low debt, particularly external debt. Second, macroeconomic conditions. This is investment rates and the openness of the economy. And for a small open economy like South Africa, where you need both to mobilize both domestic investment and foreign investment, this becomes very critical. Third, technological capacities and capabilities. In 2005, it was issues like the penetration of PCs, phones, and the internet. Now, of course, we've gone further into 5G and so on. So the importance of connectivity, and in our case, the issue of the spectrum becomes very important. Human capital, that's education and life expectancy. So if companies feel that the education system produces the kind of people who are easy to train and skill, then they have confidence to invest. But if they don't have that confidence, then there's a problem in the investment. Political conditions, political stability, rule of law, and anti-corruption. So those sort of create an environment of what we call the growth environment scores. It's about 13 of these growth environment scores. And I think before we can blame the private sector for not investing or this or so on, we must check whether these growth environment scores are sufficiently there. If that, as Edgar was trying to explain, and Sepiso, is consuming the savings which are there in the economy, so there becomes less savings for investments in the typical classical S equal to I equation. So I think, but also the other thing which I can say here is a question of race, class, gender, and investment. So, and that's why it's so important that we also broaden ownership of the economy so that we remove the kind of notion that the private sector is all white, and therefore these white people don't want to invest, which is incorrect. But we must broaden the scope for investment. I thought the technical team from the National Treasury have tried to answer everything else, but I think page 17 of the book is very important, where Duncan and his team have put together table 2.2 about the macroeconomic performance and projections. Very important that we internalize this book as well, and this table is very important as well, in addition to the first couple of pages that I recommended to members. So once again, in terms of the budget process, that's how it goes, and cabinet ministers and their DGs are familiar with the budget until the end. Then we consolidate everything, that clear the fiscal framework had already been agreed, and then finally the special cabinet meeting to do the final sign-off. Honorable Chairperson,
Thanks very much, Minister, and your team for the comprehensive briefing and response in regard to budget 2021. Of course, we'll continue to engage. Next week, we'll start with public hearings and then take the process forward. The last point that you raised, Minister, an inclusive economy is quite very, very important. It is a fact that this economy continues to marginalize Africans, females, youth, people with disability, and SMEs. It's factual. If you look at the stats that have been released by the Stats SA last week, unemployment has grown to 32% or so. And obviously, those who are hardest affected are Africans and young people. So this economy that we are talking about, that is being, that have to develop, that have to grow, it should grow with inclusivity. It can't grow to benefit one sector of the population. And that is a political matter. And in other platforms, Minister, you will remember that we have raised the issue of public procurement bill. And the President have spoken about this bill in a debate on the SONA. And I believe that this time around, 2021, the bill will be tabled in Parliament. The state is the biggest procurer of services. More than 800 billion or so is spent on procuring services. Do we have the percentage breakdown as to who benefits? How much do women benefit from 800 billion plus? How much do Africans, youth, and people with disability benefit? Last year, government rolled out intervention measures, 500 billion out there into the economy, and money for the SMEs. But if you remember, when the minister responsible for small businesses responded in Parliament, she indicated that almost 70% of that money went to white companies. That is on record. And I think that has to be corrected, Minister. This is quite very, very, very important. Out there, the sectors that I've mentioned continue to be marginalized by this economy. But thanks very much for your briefing and the responses that you have made in regard to Budget 21. And also thank very much to the DG, the Deputy Minister, officials, and those who are in attendance. Thanks very much, honorable members. We have to break. Can we continue next week with our meeting? I think Tuesday we are having a meeting.
Responded to. We have asked specific questions meeting, which have to be responded to. There's a specific question. If National Treasury cannot respond now, can we get a commitment on when is the response going to come on? How many people are you going to vaccinate and where they
let's do like this, Honorable Shwam. Let's not, with the Assistant of Secretariat, Tebuch and Allen, the questions that might not have been responded to, some are those that come from Honorable Shibambu. I see Honorable Hill Lewis. I have to close the meeting. Send them to the minister's office. The minister will say like how he has distributed responsibilities today to get those questions to be responded to in writing. And I think
that is absolutely out of order. We've got every right to make follow-up on questions that are not answered. How else do we hold the executive to account? There must be a commitment on how many people are you going to vaccinate with 10 billion and whether they are going to follow procurement procedures in the usage of that 10 billion. That is
Honorable.
Straightforward question. Yeah. Right now, the minister is the one who made the commitment unprovoked on a sovereign wealth fund. When is it being established? Is there a budget for that? What is the position on the Reserve Bank? Those questions must be responded to.
Yes, Honorable Shibambu, you are right. I'm saying that can we put those questions in writing that haven't been responded to and get the minister to respond to those questions in writing? I believe next week when we meet on Tuesday, the responses will have come from the office of the minister. I'm not saying that I'm closing up without the minister responding to those questions. No, he will have to respond to them in writing.
Yes, Chairperson.
Yes. Can I be allowed to round up? And as I was saying that thanks, honorable members and Minister, Deputy Minister, DG, those who were in attendance from the public, the media, and other stakeholders. Alan, the next meeting on Tuesday, what time is it? Is it 9 o'clock?
Chair, yes, that's 9 o'clock. It's again all four committees. That's the PBO and FFC briefing the committees.
Okay. Our next meeting, colleagues, will be next week, Tuesday, 9 o'clock. Thanks very much. The meeting is officially closed.
Thank you, Chair.
Pleasure, Honorable Peters.
Long live the chair.